Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was murdered last week and has turned into a huge uproar. A lot of our audience skews older, 55 plus, so parents and grandparents have suddenly discovered who Charlie Kirk is, and they're worried that his network is maybe radicalizing their kids and grandkids. So I wanted to provide some information about Kirk and what's going on down in the United States. And I'll be joined shortly by Matthew Boedy, who's the associate professor at the University of North Georgia. His research focuses on conservative youth movements, Christian nationalism, and right-wing rhetoric that mobilizes young people, especially via groups like Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk. So welcome to the interview, Matthew.
Happy to be here.
There's so much to unpack here. It's almost hard to know where to start, but the Trump administration has taken some action over the last few days that I really think we need to lead off with. And it seems like the administration is going to criminalize leftist ideology, leftist criticism, and so on. What's your take on that?
Yes, I do think that President Trump will use many arms of the federal government to seek retribution upon different people and different groups for the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We've seen this kind of already through his attacks upon higher education, large lawsuits, large fines against groups, and that will continue. He's already sued a bunch of media organizations. So that type of operations will certainly work. Now, if you add, again, the Department of Justice or the Department of Education or any type of group that oversees or regulates any type of group, you can see where this could go. So right now, the vague claims of radical left organizations or non-governmental organizations that played some sort of role in, we don't really know. Played some sort of role in saying something. But we should also mention the other non-governmental operation now, which is collecting comments and posts by people who say either heinous things about the murder or negative things about Charlie Kirk, and they're being reported to their employer and being fired. So it is a large campaign right now against the enemies that Donald Trump sees.
We're going to talk about Charlie Kirk first, and then at some point, I want to talk about how there might be links to Canada, because we've already seen in Alberta the Premier Danielle Smith has made some public comments that are very sympathetic to his widow and her desire to continue with his mission, as it were. So let's talk about Christian nationalism. How would you describe that and his role in it?
I would say very simply, it's the desire to Christianize America, and I would argue, of course, it's a chance to destroy democracy because they want to work from anti-democratic means. So when I say Christianize America, mainly from Turning Point, that means winning the culture war, not merely fighting it and raising a lot of anger. So winning the culture war means in our 7 major cultural institutions is having both Christians in charge of them, electing some of them to government. But also when I say a Christian consensus in our culture is to not allow media and entertainment that go against that. It is a minority movement, this culture war that they want to do through Turning Point. And I emphasize that because they want to put particular people in charge of these institutions so that they would have power to enforce their cultural rules, specifically white Christian culture. And so the culture war is the victory they want to see from the death of Charlie Kirk.
I have to say, back in my misbegotten youth in the 80s, I spent 5 or 6 years in evangelical churches in Saskatchewan, which is the prairie province. And I remember the beginnings of this, focus on the family and moral majority and Jimmy Swaggart and so on,
Mhm.
and how that changed my peers who were young parents, in their 20s and 30s. And it seems like now, 40 years hence, this is the culmination of that. Would you agree that this has been,
Certainly.
yeah,
Yeah. So if you think about the moral majority or the Christian coalition, they acted in many ways to go at the culture war, just in a couple of areas, government and education perhaps being one of them. But Turning Point because of its size, because of its budget, because of its led by a youth and millennial age, is going at all of the cultural institutions. And this is not, of course, different than the president, Donald Trump, doing the same thing, taking a direct aim at our cultural institutions that he thinks, of course, cost him election or cost him some other things. So it is a decades-long attempt to take back our culture. The particular strategy that Turning Point is using, or that is being funded by Turning Point, is called the Seven Mountains Mandate. And this metaphor of seven mountains that we need to reclaim for Jesus started out in 1975 with a list of seven institutions that they wanted to influence. They, meaning two particular people, Bill Bright, who founded Campus Crusade for Christ, known as Cru, and a guy named Lauren Cunningham, who founded the global mission organization Youth with a Mission. And they met in August in 75 and said, these are the seven areas we would like to influence for Jesus. And I want to emphasize that word influence because over the years, as you point out, it's changed to so much from influencing and putting Christians in these organizations to taking them back, taking them over. Some people would call that a theocracy. Some people would call that Christian dominionism, that is taking the dominions back from Satan or anti-Christian forces. But really, what Turning Point has done is raise the rhetoric, raise the stakes of this victory that they have been wanting for so long, to finally be at a moment where they can claim success at the federal government. Now they want the six other cultural institutions under their thumb.
What would be those institutions?
So the media, entertainment, education, family, and religion. That is, they want a Christian culture and therefore the Christian church to be the center, not just of communities and cities, but sort of a national, not just moral conscience that one might say that Martin Luther King wanted it to be, but a command center, an akin to a city council, a national cultural zeitgeist that has power to enforce cultural norms. Sometimes, if you think about the mountain of government, obviously electing Christians to government, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House in America, is a follower of the Seven Mountains Mandate. So that's pretty simple to understand. But at one mountain, like the mountain of family, it means enforcing their definition of the definition of family and gender through perhaps mocking or belittling or silencing voices that don't match that, and that's through different means, cancel culture being one of them. So you can see the different ways in which they would try to not merely influence culture, but to change it so it has a Christian consensus. And to be honest with you, the definition of Christian in that scenario is mainly Protestant. There's a couple of groups of Catholic nationalists out there, like J.D. Vance is a part of, but it's certainly not a religious pluralistic society.
Let's talk about youth, because one of the things that strikes me about this is that Charlie Kirk framed this struggle as a moral crusade.
Mhm.
And that is very appealing to millennials, to younger people. And, you know, we all were in our 20s and wanted an identity, wanted to be part of something bigger. And so I can understand the attraction. How did he do it, and what kind of success did he have?
So Charlie Kirk started Turning Point in 2012 as a high school student. And it really was a man against the world mantra. He talked about indoctrination in his high school. Of course, he famously never went to college. I think he would be successful there. But what that led to was this attack upon higher education, being indoctrination camps, leftist professors. And so one of the first viral moments was a professor Watchlist with a listed professor they didn't like. I was one of the first people listed that. But in terms of youth and millennial, it really was a social media phenomenon. He used social media so well into developing relationships with people, of course, but posting short clips. So one of the things that Turning Point famous for it, and Charlie Kirk going to campus and having these debates and offering up the microphone to any particular person, professors, students, and they would come and ask questions, and he would answer them, sometimes civilly, sometimes not. But what Turning Point was famous for was creating these short clips of Charlie Kirk always winning the debate. And so the headline would be Kirk schools another sad leftist student, or Kirk burns another confused professor. And so these clips are what made Turning Point throughout the years become famous because, as you know, YouTube and TikTok, these are the things that young people watch.
The This is interesting because we've done a couple of videos on Charlie Kirk since his assassination, and we've had this comes as no surprise to you. We've had a fair amount of criticism on the threads on social media, and one of the claims is always that Charlie Kirk was a great debater. He would debate anybody. He was fair. He was reasonable. That sort of thing and I don't know Kirk's work well enough to comment, but you do. What would you say to that?
Well, as I said before, Charlie Kirk never lost a debate, and mainly because the debates that he put on, both on campus and in other venues, were not necessarily what we think is formal debates with sides and judges, judging the validity of different arguments. They were performative pieces. Charlie Kirk was smart. He both was smart in marketing and he was well read. So I'm not suggesting he was stupid at all. But at the same time, it really was a back and forth where the points made were conceded to, but you wanted to make your bigger point so that you would look like for the crowd that you would win. In many ways, that's what it was for. It was to rile up the crowd. It was to cause division, to see that the person at the microphone was losing or it said something that didn't make sense. And to be honest with you, this is why if I went to a Charlie Kirk event, and I went to several, I would never participate in a Q&A at a microphone, because a lot of the clips you see are people who are not prepared to debate someone like Charlie Kirk. I mean, he's certainly knowledgeable, certainly had a lot of facts at hand to play with, but at the same time, he was not as civil 100% of the time. And during his radio show and other platforms, he spread conspiracy and said things that were factually wrong. So Charlie Kirk was very good at his job, which was organizing people and also giving conservative students a platform to say what they wanted to say. So if you think about, some people have suggested that Charlie Kirk was a champion of free speech. Yes, he used the avenues of free speech. He used the available means of free speech on college campuses to promote his platform. And then he invited people up to say whatever they want to say. But I don't think he would then say, well, that's great that you have to say it and we disagree to disagree. He would never say something like that. He used free speech to promote his speech.
Let's talk about some of the things he said, because I've watched some video now of him making points. And as a Canadian, I mean, I was appalled.
Hmm.
That's some pretty abhorrent speech, racist, uh, white supremacist stuff, very bigoted. And that's one of the things that, the feedback we're getting from parents and grandparents is, holy moly, I don't want my kids and grandkids exposed to that. How bad was it in your opinion?
Charlie Kirk framed himself as a truth teller, as a person who would say things that you can't say. I mean, the beginning of Turning Point in 2012 was around the time that this idea of political correctness was, that he would say was strangling our nation. So he said things that other people wanted to say that they couldn't, and he said things in a way that was particularly provocative because he framed himself as a truth teller. Again, I think that Charlie Kirk said a lot of things that were wrong, both morally and factually, things that pointed out particular demographics, particular people in high places, Supreme Court justices, things like that. And he did that because he wanted to promote a certain idea of culture and cultural strength and coming from Christianity. But I think, of course, he wanted to use that division. He wanted the people in the crowd who were his supporters, who could not say that because they would be canceled or they would be harassed or hangled. But he wasn't, because of his platform. Many of the things that he said in the last few years were part of this push of Christian nationalism, because he thought that these people on the other side were destroying our nation. We're not Christians, we're anti-Christian. So I think he said many things that were anti-immigrant, were divisive in terms of race and gender and economic class, much like the president. So that he was young and said it, I don't think it makes much difference, but he was in many ways what the president was, just behind a microphone.
We'll get to his relationship with Donald Trump in a moment. But one of the things that he was known for was this grievance culture, the us versus them, which is which is such a characteristic of politics.
Certainly. Yeah.
And we've seen this, particularly in the last 10 years in Canada. We
Mhm.
now have Alberta, which is kind of our Texas,
Okay.
and has, we've had, Alberta has had, premiers who were Christian radio personalities,
Mm.
evangelists, that kind of
Okay.
thing.
All
And
right.
it's very, very strong. And it is actually the whole culture is it's like a grievance culture. But we're
Mhm.
seeing it now in other provinces. And this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in this because it's like it bleeds
Certainly.
over the border eventually. What can you tell us about this us versus them grievance culture that and his role in it?
Well, again, the origin stories of Turning Point are why he started the organization and famously didn't go to college because he was rejected from a college he applied to, West Point, as our military academy, and he mainly went there for the free tuition or wanted to go there for the free tuition. And his original story was that his spot was taken from him by someone of a different gender, a different persuasion, a different race. And so that chip on his shoulder became a national grievance tour. He talked about different grievances. That is, there was a war on white people, that young white men were being attacked, and there was a war on them. There was a war on Christian culture, that Christians were being persecuted in America, which is unfathomable, absurd. And I think that Donald Trump, of course, extended that grievance culture to many different people in his coalition. So the grievance culture is perhaps an us versus them, but it is primarily suggesting that the them started it. And that gives justification for the us, in this case, Charlie Kirk's side, to do whatever it is they want. So they're canceling people now for comments about his death when they were against cancel culture before. They talked about, again, that the Democrats stole the election, which was not true, and that gave justification for January 6th. So the grievance culture is not merely complaining about losing, it is turning that around to suggest, of course, now we have a justification for acting in any way that we want. And this is really the danger part of what is coming from the responses to Charlie Kirk's death.
My understanding is that he's particularly popular amongst young men.
Mhm.
And that's where he does a lot of his recruiting is amongst young men. Could you talk about that for a bit?
And this is the really deeply complicated but ironic part of the person they arrested for his assassination. A young man, 22, from Utah, who may have taken some college classes, a young white man involved in obviously gun culture, video online culture. This is the type of person that Charlie Kirk wanted to put into his movement. This is the type of person that Charlie Kirk urged to get married and have children at a young age. This is the type of person that Charlie Kirk would say, you don't need to go to college for a career. So if you think about his assassin and the type of person that we know little information about him, this was the type of person. Young white men who did feel aggrieved, who thought that if they did go to college, some of their courses were wasted because they were majoring in a something else. But it was really also about the large amount of young people, specifically young men, who felt they were under attack, who felt that they weren't being treated equally because of DEI or affirmative action or any of those things. So, yes, these are the people that show up at the campus rallies and get the red hats that he throws out into the crowd.
Let's talk about the watch lists and pressure tactics and harassment. I mean, you're on a watch list. What was that like for you?
So back in 2016, when nobody knew who Turning Point was, one of their first viral moments was creating this list of professors they didn't like. And let's be honest with you, this is not the first time people have come up with a list of professors they didn't like. But what Turning Point did was, ratchet up the rhetoric on those lists. So I was put on the list for merely writing an opinion piece about advocating against guns on campus, allowing concealed weapons on college campuses, which is allowed in my state and probably 10 to 15 other states in America. And so it was a collection of comments and writings and social media posts that they didn't like. Some it was about classrooms and what they were teaching, but really it was a list of their picture, and they were kind enough to use my wedding picture. So in 2016, that was our first list of 100. Now, Almost 10 years later, that list has gone to 700 to 800, and many of my colleagues who are black or female or teaching sociology or more, if you will, controversial topics have gotten the online mob targeted to them. So it's not just email harassment or comments on their pages. It is a direct list. It's a target list of people that perhaps want to enforce their rules against professors speaking up. And we see this broader attack upon professors. There are other lists that Turning Point does. There's a school board watch list, which is about school board members and things, school boards and districts that do things they don't like. There is, there's other lists, but that really is the type of thing that they do. They make lists and they promote it on their websites. They update it. When someone says something terrible, they make sure that they promote that and put their picture up. So it is a ready-made list for whatever else is going to happen in the coming days.
How did that affect you directly, or how does it affected other academics directly? That were there,
Yeah,
complaints?
I mean, I think early on, because I was one of the first 100 people, certainly with a lot of media coverage about it, because it's kind of a McCarthyist list. But because nobody really knew who Turning Point was, I didn't receive a lot of harassment early on. But as the list has grown and as they have used it in their marketing and used it on his radio show, many people have felt not just harassed or targeted, but under siege on their campus because of just the mob keeps growing. And now the list has become sort of a vibe because Turning Point and other conservative organizations have pushed students to start secretly recording their professors in class, thinking they would say something or egging them on to say something. And we saw this last week in Texas, a comment from professors to a student in a class, and that video went viral, and that professor has been fired. So this videotaping of professors is a direct result of the kind of actions that the Professor Washlitz wants people to take.
My understanding is that this is, the members of Turning Point, the followers of Charlie Kirk, people who, young folks who participate in this grievance culture, really see this as a rallying point. It's kind of reminds me in its own perverse way of what the 60s,
Mhm.
you that had that counterculture and
Yeah.
protest culture, and young conservatives feel like that they're involved in a crusade, in a
Yes.
moral crusade. Maybe you could
Mhm.
discuss that.
Well, if you think about the Seven Mountains Mandate and the idea of taking back our culture, the thing that they implicitly and sometimes explicitly say they're taking it back from is the 60s. In the student protest movement, I wrote a book on Kent State and the effects upon it on higher education called May 1970. And so I've read a little bit about that. And the one thing that we should remember from Kent State, the shooting of the four students there, was President Nixon first implemented a law and order response to the many schools that didn't had protests after that, and up to the expansion of the Vietnam War. So if we think about that, that's what they're doing. That's what President Trump is doing now, and he's obviously used that phrase many times. So it is a reverse, as you point out, counterculture, but it is not merely a protest movement now because they're in power and they're going to then make sure that the mission, the agenda, the culture war that Charlie Kirk fought is they now win in a permanent kind of way.
His wife, Erica, had a very interesting response after his death. She talked about how her mission now was to continue his work, to make Turning Point. I think she talked about doubling or tripling it, something like that. And there's been a real outpouring of support for her. Again, I
Mhm.
mentioned earlier, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, was very warm and encouraging towards her
Yeah.
that way. And so now that he's gone, what are the chances that his widow will be able to continue that through Turning Point?
You don't replace Charlie Kirk. I don't think they're going to find one person, and I certainly don't think it'll be Erica for various reasons. Obviously, the two small children play a role in that. But her statement the other night, what it did was release the army that Charlie Kirk has created. There will be a million Charlie Kirks. There's a T-shirt being sold now on the Turning Point website saying, "I am Charlie Kirk." So they're releasing the people that he energized and organized to do all the things that they now want done. There might be a CEO named a Turning Point, but Turning Point before his death was the indispensable organization for conservative causes, and it will be that now tenfold because of the 7 areas in which they're involved in, the 7 areas that now all these people can go into and say, "Here's what I want to do," but also the way in which she framed her husband's death, which is horrific and tragic and terribly evil. She framed it as this moral crusade, this divine moment to take back our country, and that now that everything that Turning Point says you should do now has divine approval. And I can't stress that is dangerous for our country.
She also talked about how that he had been made a martyr, and
Mhm.
that would then unleash Turning Point and unleash this culture, just as you were saying.
Yeah, so that word, she said that Charlie, now wears the glorious crown of a martyr. And that particular phrase or that word has a long history, obviously, in Christianity. And it certainly honors the person, no doubt. It also then gives this motivation for the ends justifying the means, because everything now is done in his name. And particularly if you think about the history of martyrdom, the people that were persecuted for their faith, who were burned at the stake, they were mostly killed by government officials or by regimes. This was not the case here. And so you can see where the martyrdom rhetoric would go. It went directly from Erica Kirk saying he was martyred. She was not the only one, of course, to J.D. Vance saying we're going to target organizations, to Donald Trump saying we're going to target radical leftist groups. So you can see in some manners they've already created a they, and that same they is the they that shot at President Trump, even though we knew who the person was that did that in Butler, Pennsylvania. So martyrdom rhetoric, in this case, the killing of a particular person, makes that person not just an individual hero to the movement. It makes that person's name the thing that would not just empower or influence or motivate, but makes them go beyond, above and beyond what it is they were doing. If you thought that Turning Point was a political organization before, knocking on doors, getting candidates elected, making persuasive topics or arguments on college campuses on many topics, that is the bare minimum that they expect now. So if I think about the plan, the Seven Mountains Mandate to Christianize America and destroy democracy, the anti-democratic means now will be the above and beyond that I'm referring to.
Now, Matthew, we've got the in Canada, where I would argue, even though we have a fairly large Christian population, or
Mm.
Christianity has been around in Canada for a long time, but I think we're primarily a secular nation.
Okay.
Christianity, as I've worked in the U.S., down in Texas and in California, it's not the same. It just is not.
It is
Christianity,
not, no.
yeah, Christianity is such a big plays such a big role in American culture. And I know I can imagine Canadians, watching this interview and going, "Well, yeah, but look at, it's not a big deal in Canada. Like how influential could this movement be?" But in the U.S., it's an entirely different situation, is it not?
Yes. And let me just say, Turning Point tried to start a Canadian branch back in 2018. And I think it died pretty quickly for that very reason that you pointed out. It did not have the seeds in the ground that allowed it to grow. But Turning Point has other international branches. And I think this is a point on America. They have a branch in the UK. There's a Turning Point UK. There's a Turning Point Australia. And Charlie Kirk was in South Korea, which has a large Christian population, last week exporting these ideas. So the tying of religion and politics is a long history in America, but particularly the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation, that we are a city on a hill, that the Puritans and the Pilgrims were God's mission to create a freedom-loving country. These are all lines that Charlie Kirk and Turning Point would want to use to then bring us back to that point, to unleash his army to Christianize America again, seeing how we lost it perhaps in the 60s. I live in Georgia, and throughout the South, this message is very clear. You tie Christianity and patriotism together because America is God's special nation. And let me add that the idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate, the idea to Christianize America means to create America for the return of Jesus, to create America enough to become a Christian nation so that Jesus can return and rule over it at that point. This is the end times theology that's been driving conservative Christians for decades.
I'd like to get you to comment on an interview that I did a couple of years ago with retired professor Trish Roberts Miller from
Okay, I know her, yeah.
yeah, and her argument around authoritarian libertarianism, which is a mouthful, and she even hated the term herself. But
Yes.
the best way I can explain it for my audience is Henry Ford's old saying, you can have any car, you can have your car in any color you want as long as it's black. And the ideology is you can be totally free, 100% free as long as it's freedom we approve of. And if you don't do it, we will enforce our version of freedom. How does that, do you agree with her that that applies here? And what role is it playing in this radicalization of youth?
And we certainly see this in the cancel culture that is rising fast around comments in Charlie Kirk's death. There are people saying, you shouldn't be able to say these things. Well, obviously they're not free. I think also with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, they talked, they mingled, they tied very directly the political freedom and the religious freedom. So certainly they would talk about the Constitution and liberty and freedom, but that freedom and liberty had a religious source point. And he would say often people would come to my rallies to hear about the political freedom, and I would point them to the religious liberty source point. And that is a nationalized thing. And I kind of want to explain that is that, yes, you can be free in America as long as you both talk about political freedom and then talk about the religious freedom. That is, if you talk about political freedom or political issues that don't agree with that religious freedom idea, then you may not be allowed to say it. And religious freedom, of course, is directly tied to a Protestant ethos. When they say they want to make America Christian again, they sometimes say it's a Protestant ethos, and particularly the First Amendment, which again, it's everyone goes to. Wait a minute, there's separated church and state here, and there's freedom of religion here. Charlie Kirk has said at times that the founding fathers, yes, wanted freedom of religion, but they wanted people to be free to choose a Protestant sect. The government would not choose between Protestant sects. That's his definition of freedom of religion.
Let's get back to this idea of how widespread it is. I think we agree that that there's this pressure within the culture religious pressure that comes from the evangelical churches and so on. Is it 10% of the population? Is it 25%, 50%? Is it, do you see it in government where,
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been polling on Christian nationalism and the tenets that people might agree with it. And you can think different elements polled differently, but about 40 to 45% would agree with some elements of Christian nationalism.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, I'm absolutely shocked. I don't even think that in Canada, like surveys show that a much smaller proportion would
No,
even
yeah.
identify as
So, I mean, some
Christian.
of the elements are, would you agree that America was a Christian nation? Another element might be, would you think there should be a president that's allowed to break laws to fix the nation? Back to the Seven Mountains Mandate, there's been polling and surveys on that. So roughly about 30% of Americans, which obviously is a large amount of conservatives, would say, I would agree with the tenets of the Seven Mountains Mandate. It is taken over as an organizing force, the Republican Party. So 80, 90% of the Republican Party would agree with this. So you have to sort of guess, of the MAGA contingent, of the people that voted for Donald Trump, not everybody is going to describe themselves as Christian or conservative Christians, but a lot of them, even if they don't describe themselves as Christians or conservative Christians, would give credence to the president to make this country moral again, perhaps in the ways that he would want to do it. So it's kind of hard to say what percentage of people. I would just say that Turning Point is the largest of the organizations, the most well-known organization within the MAGA coalition. And so if you think our country is divided 50-50, then again, 30 to 40% of that 50 would go along with that.
I promised at the beginning of the interview we'd get to Donald Trump and MAGA and the relationship with Charlie Kirk. Maybe you could describe that for us.
Um, you know, I think that the best way to describe it, in terms of relationships, Charlie Kirk had a very strong relationship with the president and the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump, the president, probably saw Charlie Kirk as a son. And Donald Trump Jr. was introduced to Charlie Kirk in 2016. Charlie Kirk just kind of volunteered to be his personal assistant for the campaign, and they developed a strong relationship. They write forwards to each other's books. Charlie Kirk, becoming the political kingmaker that he was, introduced J.D. Vance to Donald Trump and convinced the president to put him on the ticket. So you can see just that one example really is about the power of the networking and the centerpiece, the hub that Charlie Kirk was, even at a young age. He was put in charge of the president's reelection campaign in terms of Arizona and collecting ballots, and he specifically was put in charge of the young people operation that brought in a new higher percentage of young people to vote for Donald Trump in 2024. And Turning Point throughout the years, I think Donald Trump has appeared at Turning Point events 20 times in his first and second terms and in between. And they have all the other people you can think of in terms of at these events. So the relationship between Donald Trump and Charlie Kirk is immensely strong. There can be no criticism of Charlie Kirk from within the right or the White House, and that's why I say that Charlie Kirk was the most influential person outside of the White House.
I know you've got to run, Matthew. Maybe what you could do is look out over the next this year into the end of 2026. What might happen? What do you think is most likely to happen as a consequence of the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
Well, one would hope to think that the emotional fervor that is raised in the last few days and perhaps will continue in the next few weeks may die down. But I don't think that will be the case. The assassination of Charlie Kirk is quite different than the assassination of an elected official or the potential assassination of Donald Trump as a candidate. This is a person who was not in office. And because of his following with certain age groups, those people are angry, not just merely frustrated, but they want an outlet for their anger. And I think that Donald Trump will provide that. He will act in ways and use the federal government that we all were afraid of when he was elected the second time. And now he has the justification, perhaps that he didn't have before. And there will be no criticism of it coming because it would then be tied to criticism of the death of Charlie Kirk. So we have a silencing of critics. You have a silencing of people in his party who might say something to him. You have the full-on power of the federal government, and you have a large amount of people who now are speaking up, if you just want to say that, and want something done. I have a book coming out in 2 weeks about Charlie Kirk. I'm particularly worried about the next 2 weeks. I can't suggest what would happen electorally in 2026 because I mean that is a far piece away. But there are targets out there already, and I do believe that they will be targeted.
Just quickly, give us a little plug for your book. What's the title?
The title of it is The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. It's published by Westminster John Knox Press, and its official publication date is September the 30th, but obviously it's available for buying in people's mailboxes as I speak. It is a book about the Turning Point USA plan to make the Seven Mountains Mandate into a success, and therefore what the Charlie Kirk agenda will be in his name in the coming months.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for this. Insightful, and probably we'll have you back because I agree with you. The story is not going away.
No, thanks for having me.